G'day mates, and welcome to the Keto Island podcast. In our very first debut episode, I would like to introduce Elliot Overton. He is a functional medical practitioner based in the UK and is an expert on nutrition and nutrients of how it affects the diet. And one interesting topic that is not frequently discussed today is vitamin B1, the very first vitamin that was ever discovered, and how the effects of the modern day diet can induce deficiencies, and also how carnivores may need to pay attention to this very important nutrient and what foods and other things impact it in everyone's journey to optimal health. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the very first episode. So Elliot Overton, welcome to Keto Island podcast. My name's Simon. Today I'd like to just have a chat to you about different things regarding thiamine deficiency that's prevalent inside the world today. Would you like to first give a bit of an intro about yourself and your background?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Simon. It's great to be here. So I am a nutritionist. I'm based in the UK. I have a little bit of training in functional medicine. I'm currently doing a fellowship over in the United States. And I have a particular interest in what you might call orthomolecular medicine, orthomolecular nutrition, essentially the use of vitamins and minerals in supraphysiologic doses, which basically means more than a lot more, exponentially more than what you would get in the diet, to help address chronic health issues. Okay. So,
yeah, a lot of people that I speak to in regards to that, a lot of people talk about that if you clean up the diet and everything's running perfectly in the diet, then the body should naturally correct itself. Do you believe that there is a use for high dosage supplementation for some people in those instances that might not naturally be able to correct itself?
Well, I think the people who say that you should be able to get everything from the diet, I think they're partially correct, and it depends on context. So I would say in certain people, if they are relatively robust, they've had quite a poor diet in the past, and then they adopt a diet which is high in nutrient density, so micronutrients, then ultimately diet may be sufficient. But that is only a portion of the population. And I can say almost with certainty that there are other parts of the population, other people who the nutrition coming purely from the diet is simply not sufficient. And I think that in an ideal scenario, if you go back maybe a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 years or so, in our natural environment, then a diet which was high in nutrient-dense foods would likely suffice for everyone. That's the way that we are designed to function, right? We take our nutrients from food and from water and all of this stuff, and then we do what we need to do. But we are no longer living in an environment which is what you would call natural. In fact, it's highly unnatural in a variety of ways, in that many of the toxins, many of the chemicals, many of the influences we are exposed to in our modern world effectively deplete us of very essential nutrients. And so it's almost like we need to somehow counteract that in many ways, or there are some people who need to do that. And one of the ways to do that is by using very high doses of certain nutrients to account for the deficits.
Yeah. So basically we've created something that is completely physiologically impossible going back 1,000 years or so. So something completely unnatural created it. So certain measures need to be taken in order to almost return things back to a baseline more so than anything.
It seems that way. It honestly does. And someone might argue that supplementation is unnatural. It's made in a factory. It's made in it's synthesized in a lab. And whilst I would agree with that, what is unnatural is not always detrimental. Okay. It's not always a bad thing. It's like cars are unnatural and planes are unnatural, but people still drive cars and they still go on holiday. And it's like, okay, this might be unnatural in the kind of ancestral sense of the word. But ultimately atrazine, glyphosate, gasoline and exhaust fumes, these things are unnatural as well. And these have an extraordinarily toxic effect on the human body. And so actually we can counteract that. And we can do that by repleting the things that those things or that those toxic influences have on us.
Yeah. So everything sort of layers up more so than anything, doesn't it? So certain people, you'll probably be more predisposed than other people to certain influences in the environment. And it's almost like a pair of scales where each person can sort of handle a load before things get out of kilter, where you'll get some people that will be completely fine under that same environmental stresses, and other people that sort of conk out like an air conditioner in a car going up a hill and their motor isn't functioning as well, and they turn on the air conditioner and their car just completely burns out. So there's sort of a load for a lot of people about how much genetically that they can handle more so than other people.
Yeah, it seems for sure that some people just come into this world with an upper hand, right? They've been dealt a good hand of cards, so to speak, whereas other people are the opposite, and they actually are much more susceptible, probably for a variety of reasons. And this is both genetic and also environmental or kind of congenital, right? So it depends on your mother's health, on your father's health, on your environment growing up, on your diet growing up, on your microbiome, on all of these different things that can really contribute toward whether someone has the capacity to deal with the toxins and with our kind of unnatural modern lifestyle, I think.
Yeah, and that's where people like yourself come into really good use in order to sort of narrow down people's personal history included in everything as well, to be able to figure out where they are, where they're going, and what impacts that there could be, because someone's symptoms could look very similar to someone else's symptoms a lot of the time.
Yeah, and this is really one of the ideas. This is the principal thing that I try to do is help people find out what is causing their problems, right? So as you just said, 2 people can present, or 3 people can present with exactly the same symptoms. And whilst there is likely going to be some overlap there as to what is contributing to those symptoms, really the root cause could be entirely different for each person. And so you really need to hone in on the history and the other exposures that person has had, and really their lifestyle, to ascertain exactly what is going on. And this is where something like functional testing or nutritional testing can really come in handy. And I think there's more and more people doing this in today compared to 30, 40 years ago in conventional medicine. And I think that this is probably the future of where medicine is going towards, is a more functional approach or root cause approach.
Yeah. So one thing that has come up recently that I've seen from a lot of people, I don't know if you've seen it clinically, but I've met a lot of people that have been involved in either high stress incidents or car accidents or many other different things. And then certain things kick in, from type 1 diabetes to type 2 diabetes. Have you also seen yourself where someone be sort of proddling along reasonably fine, and then a stressful event would kick off a particular nutrient deficiency, etc.?
Yeah, it's pretty much the rule that that happens. In some people it doesn't, but generally there is always a trigger. If you go through someone's history, you go through their health history, they may not have what you would call optimal health, but they could have suboptimal health. They may not actually have any diagnosable condition and see themselves as relatively healthy for a long period of time. And then there is generally a trigger. And this is something you could equate to the straw that broke the camel's back. So something that tips them right over the edge. And it's after that tipping point that their health just rapidly degrades and it goes right the way downhill. And it's interesting because someone may see that trigger as the cause, but oftentimes it's not the cause. It's merely some kind of stressor. And Dr. Derek Lonsdale, Chandler Mars laid this out in their book on thiamine deficiency really well. And this is what you see almost every single time, is that there is a variety of underlying stressors, perhaps it's underlying nutrient deficiencies, chronic stressors of some sort, which build a person up and gradually, let's say, degrade their capacity to adapt. And so eventually what happens is they're in a very susceptible position, and it's a final trigger, a final event. It can be some kind of physical trauma. It can be an infection. It can be the loss of a loved one. It can be anything which is very stressful for the body, this tips them over the edge. And after that, it's very difficult to get back to where they were, because it's almost like it's exacerbating whatever was going on, and kind of makes it all 10 times worse. And so very often, as I said, the trigger is not the cause. The trigger is merely the straw that broke the camel's back, because this has been going on for many years before that point. It's just not become apparent, and the person is not consciously aware that there is an issue until they go over that point of no return, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I guess since we brought up thiamine, we should discuss thiamine, or vitamin B1 as most people know it. What is the role of vitamin B1 or thiamine in general physiology? And that's basically the main question.
Right. Well, good question. Good question. And there's probably many answers to that question. Ultimately, vitamin B1, thiamine, it's one of the essential nutrients. So essential is being, meaning that we don't make a lot in our body. We can't synthesize it in our physiology. Gut microbes can synthesize some of them, but ultimately, inside the human body, we can't make it. So it means it's essential. It means we need to get it from external sources, primarily from the diet. Okay. And all vitamins, the definition of a vitamin is essentially something that we cannot synthesize ourselves. So vitamin B1 is, like many of the other vitamins, it's absolutely essential for how we are processing energy from food. So we are taking food, we're breaking it down in the digestive tract to its constituent molecules, and that is fats, carbohydrate in the form of glucose or some other sugar, and then you have amino acids, protein. And so what we do is we break that down, and then here's an example. When we eat some carbohydrates, we eat potato, we eat rice, we will break that down into glucose. We will absorb that glucose into our bloodstream, and the glucose will then be carried around the body to go to cells which need to make energy. And when it gets into the cells, what we then have to do is essentially break down that glucose into much smaller molecules to derive energy from that. And to do that, we use certain enzymes. And so enzymes are essentially proteins, or you can think of them like little machines inside of a cell, which convert one thing into another thing. And when we are deriving energy from food, we need to break things down, and we do that via enzymes. Now, certain enzymes require what we call cofactors. So they need to use things to be able to work properly. So on the topic of thiamine is a cofactor for a wide variety of enzymes involved in how we are deriving energy from that food. So one of those in particular is called pyruvate dehydrogenase. Pyruvate dehydrogenase is one of the steps in how we are metabolizing carbohydrates for energy. So we are breaking down glucose. We are using this enzyme to effectively get energy from carbs. And if we don't have this enzyme functioning, then we can't effectively derive energy from carbs, okay, or sugar. Thiamine this is why thiamine is really plays center stage in the metabolism of sugar, more so than any other vitamin, actually, because other vitamins also are cofactors for other enzymes in energy metabolism. We have riboflavin, which is vitamin B2. We have niacin. We have vitamin B6. We have some of the minerals as well, iron and copper. So all of these things are really important, and they're involved in several different steps. But ultimately, thiamine is the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase is like, you can think of it as the initial step to energy metabolism. And if you don't have enough thiamine, then you cannot effectively run substrate through that initial step to get to the next steps in energy metabolism. So even if you have sufficiency in all of the other vitamins, if you don't have enough thiamine, then you cannot process energy. And when you cannot process energy inside cells, lots of bad things happen. All right. In fact, a lot of the research, medical research, physiological research these days looking at chronic diseases is really looking at it from the perspective of what we call mitochondrial dysfunction. The mitochondria is the part of the cell where you are making energy. And when you have dysfunction, it means that you are not able to sufficiently make enough energy. When you don't have enough energy, you cannot do what you need to do. And essentially, the cells become very dysfunctional in just many different ways. And so they've linked all kinds of autoimmune conditions, cancer, diabetes, practically every acquired or chronic disease that you would develop in a lifetime. They've linked this back to a cellular energy deficit. And this is really where thiamine comes in. And this is why thiamine can actually be used in a wide variety of different health conditions and have a great benefit, is because it plays that central role in the metabolism of energy. Okay. So aside from it being a cofactor in energy metabolism, it's also a cofactor for a couple of other enzymes. And these are involved in how we are, for instance, producing neurotransmitters, such as the production of acetylcholine, which is important for the nervous system. We also need it to synthesize something called glutamate, which is one of the neurotransmitters which helps us transmit signals throughout the brain. It's known as an excitatory neurotransmitter. It's very important for psychological health and brain function, cognition, these kinds of things. And thiamine is very important for how the nerves themselves are actually conducting signals. So you are using thiamine not only in energy reactions, which are breaking things down, but actually you're using thiamine in biosynthetic reactions. So when we are building things, when we are making things, one of those is called the pentose phosphate pathway. And this is how we are essentially producing fatty acids, such as myelin sheath. So if you look in the nervous system on neurons, they are coated, or they are protected by this fatty layer called myelin sheath. And this is actually helping to protect the neuron and facilitate messages being passed between neurons. So if you don't have enough thiamine, that it's actually been shown in the research that you can develop what we call demyelination, which is present in something like multiple sclerosis and also other neurodegenerative conditions. It stops how the brain is effectively able to send signals and the rest of the nervous system. But at the same time, not only do you make things like fatty acids, you can also make nucleic acids, which you use for several different things. But you are making something called, you're making a reducing agent called NADPH. And NADPH is how we are regenerating one of the antioxidants called glutathione. Now, if your listeners know anything about health or how cells kind of protect themselves against all of the toxins and waste products and things that we kind of produce on a daily basis, then glutathione takes center stage as the primary cell's primary antioxidant. So when there is any damage, when there is any kind of dysfunction, oxidative stress, inflammation, then essentially we are using glutathione to protect our cells from that damage and actually regenerate our cells. We're also using glutathione to detoxify things in the liver. So we are conjugating various toxins, metabolites with glutathione, and that is how we are getting rid of stuff out of the body, either through the bile, into the gut, out through the urine, okay? So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that thiamine plays key roles in how we are making energy. That's one thing. How we are synthesizing certain structural components, which are very important, and also how we are regenerating our antioxidant system. So when we don't have enough thiamine, all of this stuff can go wrong. Okay.
Yep. So one interesting question that I was wondering. So as a lot of people these days are now switching to lower carbohydrate diets, etc., and even going to the trend of ketogenic and then producing ketones for energy, etc., the truth is that we still produce glucose even running in that metabolic state. So someone may feel better, by switching their energy substrate to running off of ketones, etc., and feeling a bit more energized, etc. But in certain people like type 2 diabetics, etc., their energy still may not be 100%, and we're still producing glucose, and that still requires thiamine in order to function correctly. So could someone have still lower energy even if they're doing a lower carbohydrate diet, etc., which is technically thiamine sparing because they're not having as high levels of intake of refined sugars and high levels of glucose that the thiamine needs in order to demand, but we still have a standard level of blood glucose that operates in our systems and certain cells still function with them. So is it possible that certain people going low carbohydrate would still suffer from either any of the issues related to the thiamine deficiencies that may have kicked in pre them going to a better diet for themselves?
Right. Okay. So you touched on something very important there, and that I didn't mention, is that because thiamine is used up when we are burning carbohydrates, that when in our modern world, when we are consuming, because of the refined sugars, the refined carbs, all of these different things, we require more thiamine to do so, to burn that. And at the same time, if you are having things like refined sugar, you're going to be, when you refine a food, you essentially remove the thiamine from it. And what they do is they fortify some of that with less bioavailable forms like thiamine mononitrite and things like these. So essentially what's happening is when you're refining a food, you're taking out the nutrients, but you are providing a bunch of macronutrients in the forms of carbs, fats, and proteins. So essentially when you remove that, to process the carbohydrate, the fat, the protein, you need vitamins and minerals. You need those vitamins and minerals in place. And that when you refine the food, you can effectively deplete yourself of those nutrients, because you're taking in lots of energy. For every amount of energy that you're taking in the form of carbohydrate, you are using up thiamine. And so if your source of carbohydrates, such as white rice, is depleted in thiamine, then you are going to rapidly go through your stores, and it's fairly well established that you can run through your thiamine stores within kind of 30 days on a thiamine deplete diet. So this was originally how they discovered thiamine deficiency. Was the upper classes in Japan were polishing the rice. So they were taking off the husk, the outer husk of the rice, and just consuming white rice. And the problem is with that is that before anyone really understood anything about vitamins, what they didn't know was that the husk was the bit of the rice that contained the nutrients which allowed you to process the starch in the white portion of it. So they would take away the nutrients but actually consume a bunch of the starch in the form of the white rice, and then go on to develop severe chronic thiamine deficiency. And this was the kind of prototypical thiamine deficiency called beriberi, and that can manifest in the neurologic system or in the cardiovascular system. So what they found was that actually by fortifying, they identified thiamine, they started fortifying the food and supplementing with it, and they actually found that this condition was reversed relatively quickly. So we now know that refining the foods can effectively cause nutrient deficiencies in us. Now, onto your question, right? So with regard to, now that we know that thiamine, you need thiamine the most to burn carbohydrates, going on a lower carbohydrate diet is said to be relatively thiamine sparing, because when you go on a low carbohydrate diet, you naturally increase the amounts of fats while reducing the amounts of carbohydrates. When you have lower carbohydrates, you require less thiamine. When you have higher amounts of fat, then you are entering in a different metabolic pathway, which does not require thiamine to make energy. Well, it still requires thiamine, but the initial step doesn't require thiamine. You essentially bypass the pyruvate dehydrogenase portion of that, and you are going in through beta oxidation of fatty acids. What that essentially means is that you probably require less thiamine on a low carbohydrate diet. However, it's very important to note that even though you are bypassing the pyruvate dehydrogenase portion of the energy metabolism, which requires a bunch of thiamine, you are still basically you are deriving carbon from fats, but that is still entering in at a different portion of the energy kind of metabolic pathways, which is called the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle has several different enzymes. One of those is called alpha ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. Now, what you are doing with alpha ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, it's similar to pyruvate dehydrogenase in that you need thiamine as a cofactor. So essentially, whether you are burning carbohydrate or you're burning fat as your primary source of fuel, you still require thiamine. You need thiamine to burn energy, period. It doesn't matter where the energy is coming from, whether it's carbs or fats, you need thiamine. And what the problem is with high fat, low carb diets, and I'm a major advocate of these kinds of diets, don't get me wrong, but the problem is that what can happen is that when someone is intaking a very high fat diet in the context of a chronic thiamine deficiency, when you have high fat generally contains almost no thiamine. And the foods on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet can sometimes be low in thiamine themselves. And so if in the context of a chronic nutrient deficiency, simply because someone's on a high-fat, low-carb diet does not mean that they are able to address that deficiency or that they cannot actually produce a deficiency because their diet is not sufficient for the thiamine requirement. Does that answer?
It does make sense. And then that sort of goes into play with a couple of substances, particularly that can actually accelerate the use of thiamine. So if someone is consuming a diet still relatively low in thiamine and that they have either deficiency issues even leading up to when they made their diet shifts, there's some substances from my understanding that I think alcohol can affect it, that a lot of people on low carbohydrate diets will still consume quite a lot. And also there's other factors that have issues with thiamine, I think, is like coffee, maybe one of them. Are you able to explain how that may impact things?
Yeah, so essentially there are a couple of factors. You see, thiamine is very sensitive to a variety of things. So one of those is cooking. So if someone is overcooking their food, this can actually destroy thiamine before it even gets into the gut. Now, if you are destroying thiamine on a consistent basis, then that is naturally going to hurt your thiamine stores. It's going to hurt your thiamine intake. Likewise, if someone is consuming, there are what we call anti-thiamine factors. One of those is certain types of polyphenols or tannins, which are found in beverages such as tea and such as coffee. What these do is they essentially inactivate thiamine in the gut and stop us from being able to absorb it. So that is one thing. So if someone is drinking 5 cups of coffee a day, then there's a good chance that actually they could very well induce a thiamine deficiency, even though they may be getting a good amount through their diet. They're inhibiting the absorption of that or kind of inactivating that in the gut every time that they drink the coffee. So that's a potentially a problem in someone who is susceptible to this anyway. There is also alcohol. So you made a good point. Ethanol really is like the arch enemy of thiamine metabolism. Ethanol is it stops the absorption of thiamine in the gut. It can actually, inside the cells, alcohol can stop the activation of thiamine. So what we need to do is when we absorb this vitamin, we have to transport it around the blood. Then we have to get it into the cells. When it's in the cells, we can't use it. We actually have to activate it. And so when we activate it, we use enzymes. But the problem is that alcohol stops us from being able to do that, stops us from being able to activate that thiamine. So in fact, chronic alcohol use is probably one of the key risk factors for beriberi, for Korsakoff psychosis, which is like the end stage thiamine deficiency, but also subclinical thiamine deficiency. So I've got several clients at the moment who have had long stretches of alcohol use and have actually developed what I would personally say mimics subclinical beriberi. They may not be diagnosed by a doctor, but actually they are presenting with very severe end-stage symptoms of what we would call a chronic thiamine deficiency. And that can present both neurologically, digestively, and in the cardiovascular system. But That is not the only thing. Unfortunately, if someone can have a very good diet, they may not be consuming any anti-thiamine factors, but actually there are environmental influences which can stop us from absorbing thiamine, which can cause us to waste thiamine, and which can also destroy thiamine in our bodies. One of those is sulfite. So sulfite is an intermediate in the metabolism of sulfur compounds. Ordinarily, when we're metabolizing sulfur compounds in our body, we are ideally we're going to be making sulfate, which is like an inorganic form of sulfur, which is used in detoxification in making joint glycosaminoglycans, which line the joints, and all of this kind of stuff. Sulfate does a bunch of stuff, but that's a topic for another talk. But essentially, there is an intermediate in that process, and that is called sulfite. And if someone is low in molybdenum, or if they have problems with metabolizing sulfur, which many people do, they can end up with higher levels of sulfite and be unable to effectively process that. So sulfite is a very real thing, sulfite toxicity. And many people are sulfur sensitive. Now, if you have sulfite toxicity, if you're producing a lot of sulfite in the gut, or if you are producing it inside the cells, then sulfite is able to inactivate thiamine. So that is one of the potential risk factors for thiamine deficiency. There is also something else which is called hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is another kind of intermediate step in the sulfate metabolism process. And hydrogen sulfide is a gas which our cells produce to some extent. It has vasodilatory properties, so it can open and close the blood vessels. But essentially, hydrogen sulfide, if you have a certain composition of gut bacteria, what is commonly called hydrogen sulfide dominant SIBO, where you have certain microbes in the gut which produce elevated levels of this gas. If someone has flatulence and it smells like sulfur or rotten egg, it's a good chance that they have hydrogen sulfide production. And that actually hydrogen sulfide may, it seems, in the animal research anyway, can also induce the thiamine deficiency. So they found that actually in animals such as sheep and cows, that you can induce experimental thiamine deficiency by giving them a diet which is higher in sulfur compounds, which makes this gas which goes on to destroy that. So that is an issue. If there's any gut issues, if there's dysbiosis in the gut, if there is any kind of fungal issues. So for instance, there is a certain type of mold, I believe it belongs to the Aspergillus family, which produces mycotoxins which are able to degrade thiamine. Likewise, there are let me think. There are the sulfites. I was talking about sulfites. Sulfites are added to wine. They're added to many different kinds of, as like a preservative in many different kinds of packaged foods. So if there was a susceptibility and someone's having lots of sulfites, this could have a negative effect. It destroys it in the food as well. But then you also have raw fish. There is raw fish. Certain types of raw fish contain they contain thiaminases, which essentially, again, break down thiamine. So someone who's consuming lots of sushi in the context of low thiamine diet, like aside from that, that has been documented to actually contribute towards beriberi. There are probably a couple of other things that I haven't quite touched on. There's certain foods, polyphenols like blueberries and some of the other berries and things like that. Yeah, I think there's lots of things, but that's all I can think of the top of my head.
Does IBS have much of an impact on thiamine absorption?
Right. So in fact, IBS or any other chronic digestive issue is potentially going to be a risk factor for developing a chronic thiamine deficiency. In fact, if more likely so, it's going to be IBS diarrhea. So if someone has looser stools or chronic diarrhea for a very long time, then what happens is that if there is any inflammation in the gut lining, then this can actually affect how well the transporters are able to absorb thiamine. So you have malabsorption of it, but then you also have excessive excretion of it because you have such a high rate of motility, or you have chronic loose stools, you have chronic diarrhea. Thiamine is water soluble, so the body doesn't really store much of it. And that actually, if you have this issue of IBS, then this is going to, you can become depleted very quickly. In fact, if you look at some of the clinical literature on modern day beriberi, then you see that although the majority of conventional medical doctors see, or conventional medicine as a whole thinks that beriberi is a thing of the past, but actually there are many doctors now who are basically writing case presentations and clinical papers on the occurrence of beriberi or thiamine deficiency after things like gastric surgery. If anyone's had gastric surgery, this is, a quick way to develop a thiamine deficiency. There is also chronic IBS, there's IBD, so Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. All of these kinds of chronic digestive issues can very quickly cause a thiamine deficiency. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you believe it's been missed a lot, mainly because in the past, a lot of these vitamin deficiencies was due to extreme malnutrition? Are we seeing it in a completely different state now compared to the times? I mean, I know some parts of the world still have very low caloric intake and very low vitamin intake that consumes a lot of white rice, and they do have a lot of issues with thiamine deficiency. But are we seeing more prevalence now in different types of diseases where people may be ingesting enough thiamine in their diet, but due to all the foods and factors that you're talking about before that may accelerate the use? Is that one of the reasons why these things aren't really observed as well as how they were in the past?
Right. So that's an excellent question. And I am not a trained medical doctor, so I don't know exactly how much they learn about nutrition, but I suspect that it's not a lot. So there is this fantastical idea, and it's an imaginary idea. It's crazy, really. This idea that as long as you are getting enough macronutrients, so basically enough food, enough protein, enough fat, and enough carbohydrate, as long as you are hitting your caloric intake, then your nutritional needs will be met, right? And this is kind of like the overarching assumption that nutrition, the only thing that's important about nutrition is nutrition or nutritional sufficiency in the terms of macronutrients. And that was a problem of the past. So actually, it's, throughout probably the entirety of human history, getting enough calories has been an issue, right? It's been like, we have to hunt an animal. If we can't hunt an animal, then we have to, get some grains and mill some grain or whatever. So actually getting enough calories has been a problem in the past, but this is not a problem in our modern day. In fact, it's, as you said, it's gone the opposite way. So in our modern day world, we have no shortage of calories in the form of macronutrients. We have abundant access to fats, to carbohydrates in the forms of rice, potatoes, sugars, starches, corn, all of these kinds of things. And then we also have, in the Western world, at least, we have an abundance of protein. But what we are lacking now is the micronutrients. So there is such a thing, and this term was coined by Lonsdale, and it makes so much sense. It's called high calorie malnutrition. So there is a very real thing that someone can have an excess of calories coming from macronutrients, but at the same time have severe deficits in micronutrients, the micronutrients being the vitamins, the minerals, and the cofactors. So actually, in fact, it's very common that you would see someone who is clinically obese, who you would look at, and the average person would say, no, this person is not malnourished, this person is overnourished. Right? So there's this idea that if someone is overweight, they are overnourished. But it could not be further from the truth. Because if you look at the clinical literature, and I see this time and time again in my clinical practice, working with people who are overweight, in fact, the people who are overweight tend to be more malnourished, but not in terms of calories, but in terms of micronutrients. These people tend to be severely deficient in many of the B vitamins, the minerals, and certain other nutrients that we need to process energy. In fact, someone could say that perhaps one of the key reasons why this person has become obese in the first place is because because we need micronutrients to process energy, to process the macronutrients. If we don't have the micronutrients, then our metabolism slows right down. Okay, in fact, it slows right down, and it actually means that someone is no longer able to effectively burn the calories that they're intaking in the form of carbohydrate and fat. So if you can't burn those calories because of a micronutrient deficit, like a thiamine deficiency or a B2 deficiency, if you can't burn fat effectively, you're going to store it. Right? You're not going to burn it for energy. You're going to crank down everything, and you're actually going to store it instead. And so this is what the concept of high calorie malnutrition is that in fact, because we have free access to sweets, to cookies, to chocolates, to refined sugar in the form of soda, in the form of all of this different junk food, basically, it's practically deplete of nutrients. And so what we are doing is we're feeding ourselves a bunch of sugar, but we can't process it, or we're not very well able to process it because we need to match that sugar intake with thiamine. And unfortunately, that's not happening. And so what happens is that when you have chronic energy overload in the form of macronutrients and chronic deficits in micronutrients, we actually see that this is, in my opinion, one of the main causes for just a wide variety of what we call chronic illnesses. Okay. So these supposedly chronic illnesses are characterized by high calorie malnutrition.
Yeah, that's amazing. It is a mitochondrial deficit all over the place. It's sort of the perfect storm, which is absolutely amazing, really, because we're living in a world where pretty much everyone's nutritional needs, even if they eat a lot of food to excess, they may be getting all their macronutrient needs, but the foods that they're compounding is affecting the other nutrients in their body, which can cause a mismatch. And then everything gets in this vicious cycle, overload of storage, and then metabolism drops. It's absolutely a much more different picture than any time in human history, more so than anything, because of the availability and the cheapness and human inclination.
Yeah. And then I think the reason why I guess we're talking about thiamine and why this is so kind of pertinent in today's world is it comes back to this notion that, or the basic biochemistry, that thiamine is probably the most important nutrient to burn sugar or to burn carbohydrates. Now, just as it turns out, in the past 100 years, our sugar intake, or our sugar availability, and the availability of refined carbohydrates has skyrocketed. So naturally, I think the vitamin which has really taken the biggest hit personally, from what I can see clinically, is thiamine. But what you'll notice is that, in my nutritional training, thiamine was it didn't get that much attention, let's say. Now, there are not many people who talk about this. Now, Dr. Derek Lonsdale has been doing work for decades. He was like one of the pioneers, essentially, in thiamine therapy for chronic disease. But essentially, there's not many others who even acknowledge that it's a problem, because we've been indoctrinated, or we've been led to believe the lie that berry is a thing of the past. But actually, I think that it is potentially, it's like the dark horse. It's something that practically no nutritional or nutritionist or doctor talks about. There are a couple of them, don't get me wrong, but in the big scheme of things, it's very under-acknowledged, and yet its clinical or its therapeutic benefit is so wide. It's almost like it's untapped. There are so many people who could benefit from this, but really not many people even know that it's a problem. And one of the reasons for this is because it's fairly difficult to test for in terms of looking for nutrient status with regard to blood tests and things.
Yeah, and when you look at the numbers of RDI intake, it's a very low number, so it can get dismissed very easily. But it almost sounds like it's a domino effect, where this is like one of the principal dominoes that falls over first, and then all of the other B vitamins get affected by it. And then obviously, because magnesium is also a cofactor for thiamine, that status completely changes as well. And so there's a lot of dependencies on it, but also a lot of dominoes that can fall over all through the mix as well. So someone can be looking at a completely different chronic disease, but if you go back up enough steps, it might have been thiamine that may have been the thing that started breaking the camel's back as it started going through the mix. But it doesn't make the end stage any less important, but it sounds like it's at least a way to start backtracking through as you manage certain end stage diseases for people.
Yeah, that's actually a really excellent point, because what I was talking about, how thiamine is a cofactor for certain enzymes in energy metabolism. The problem is thiamine also plays like a dual role as a non-cofactor, but as what we call an allosteric regulator, which means that it has an effect on the activity of other enzymes for which it's not a cofactor. So it's not actually used by that enzyme per se, but the amount of thiamine in the cells is detected by that enzyme, and it can basically tell the enzyme to work or not to work, right? Even though it's not actually used in that enzyme or as part of that enzyme, if that makes sense. Yeah. So many of the, if you look at the mitochondria, the final stage of how we're making energy is called the electron transport chain. And in the electron transport chain, you have various complexes through which you are funneling electrons essentially to make ATP, the adenosine triphosphate, which is what we are using as our kind of energy currency inside the cell. Now, all of the complexes, the rate at which they are kind of funneling electrons depends on several factors. Ideally, you want it to be a fast process so that you're continually replenishing energy. The regulation of those enzymes, one of the factors which governs whether those enzymes function or not, is thiamine levels. So thiamine is an allosteric regulator of the complexes in the mitochondrial electron transport chain. So essentially, what the point that I'm trying to get across is that thiamine can act as almost like an energy sensor. If you have enough of that, then other kind of seemingly unrelated processes downstream inside the cells will pick up on that. It's almost like an informational thing. It will send information saying, look, we've got enough nutrients to process energy. Let's start processing energy. But if there's not enough, because it's at that initial stage, it's like everything downhill from that, all of the other processes involving the activation of other vitamins. So one of those is B6 activation. The activation and the kind of processing of other vitamins and nutrients is kind of really determined by thiamine status. And so someone may be presenting with a condition that may seem to have absolutely nothing to do with thiamine, but as you said, thiamine may have been the initial stage which kind of, let's say, led to a cascade of events or a domino effect, which eventually caused the cell to become highly dysfunctional. The problem is that when you have a systemic lack of energy or a lack of cellular energy, then this can really, you think of it like the cells need to adapt to that. And the problem is that when you have low energy inside the cells for a very long time, then activities as a whole in terms of detoxification, repair, all of these things that you need to be doing to maintain healthy cells, all of these processes become down-regulated when you have a lack of energy. And when this goes on for a long enough time, simply consuming the RDA is not sufficient. In fact, it's thoroughly insufficient. Like the RDA for thiamine is something like 1.5 milligrams, okay? Whereas if someone has been chronically low for a very long time, then taking 1.5 milligrams in the form of food or even in the form of a supplement is not going to be able to kickstart those processes to start working in the cells again. So what you actually need to do is saturate the enzymes, saturate the cells with very high doses. And this was originally what Dr. Lonsdale found, was that the only way that you could really address a chronic deficiency You can't do it through diet. You need to really saturate the cells with certain types of thiamine in very high doses, sometimes in 1,000 times the dose. And you have a personal anecdote of this, right? 1,800 times the recommended daily allowance.
Yeah, my wife suffered from chronic fatigue syndrome for many years, and she was getting a lot of the fibromyalgia pain from it all. And there was a few studies that was conducted. I think it was Dr. Antonio from memory. He was an Italian doctor, and he did a very small study with a small group of subjects with fibromyalgia, and he found increasing the dosage up to 1,800 milligrams, which was 1.8 grams, reduced the pain levels by 90 to 98% in the small study that was done. So I contacted him, and then I replicated what he did. And just like he noted in his notes, that it wasn't until they get up to that extremely high level that those pain levels started reducing. And I had exactly the same experience. We got to 1.5 grams, no difference. But it wasn't until she hit the 1.8 grams, and we did it over a course of a month by steadily increasing it, the pain levels just was the best that she has felt in many, many years. So that was very interesting. Which brings me on a side question then. My understanding that in that beginning of the cycles, as it goes through and gets into the Krebs cycle, etc., if thiamine is in low concentrations, from a lot of the screenshots I've seen, that it looks like that it goes off to the side and then lactic acid starts increasing. And then the way that I always reasoned it in my brain, that lactic acid is also a form of energy. So it's sort of like the body's backup system to produce more energy. So the body rather be functional, even running at a low energy state, but in a lot of pain because it still wants to function. And that's how I sort of visualized it in my mind.
Right. And now you bring us onto an important part of this, which I haven't discussed: what happens when there isn't enough. Now, when there isn't enough thiamine, as you just said, right, in a very simplified way, without going into much detail for the audience, essentially, we were talking about the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. It's how when you take glucose, you're getting into the cell and it's running through a process called glycolysis, and this is producing something called pyruvate, or two molecules called pyruvate. And to be able to make ATP energy, ordinarily for a glucose, you should be able to make 36 ATP in the mitochondria going through the processes that we talked about. So if the listeners aren't familiar with this, just go onto YouTube or go onto Google Images and type in mitochondrial energy production or something. Basically, it's the machine in the cell. What you're doing is you're taking the substrate and you are making certain amounts of ATP. And to do that, you need oxygen. So this is really the primary reason why you are breathing with your lungs. You are breathing because you're absorbing oxygen into the blood, oxygen's going into the cells, and you are using that to be able to make cellular energy. If you don't have enough oxygen, or if you can't run through that energy production process for whatever reason, then this is referred to as anaerobic metabolism. If you do have oxygen, it's referred to as aerobic metabolism, okay? So in the context of a thiamine deficiency, what happens is you run glucose through the initial step, which is called like glycolysis, and you produce pyruvate. But the problem is because the enzyme which takes pyruvate and converts it onto the next step to make all that ATP, that enzyme, pyruvate dehydrogenase, becomes inhibited, becomes downregulated because it needs thiamine. If you don't have enough thiamine, then you can't use the enzyme, period. That's just how it works. If you don't have the cofactor, the enzyme doesn't work. So the enzyme stops working or it becomes inhibited. And now the problem is with that is that if you've got an inhibition of this enzyme, you get a buildup of the product A, let's say the pyruvate. You get a buildup of this byproduct of glucose and it's got nowhere to go, and you need to do something with it because your cells need some energy in some way, or else they will die and you will die. So essentially you get a buildup of this kind of precursor and you need to do something with it. And the only route that you can take is lactate, is to produce something called lactic acid. Now, the audience might be familiar with what lactic acid is. It's generally the feeling in your muscles when you lift heavy weights, or when you go for a sprint, a very intense exercise, and you get that burning pain in your muscles. That is the buildup of lactic acid. And that is really as an alternative way to make energy. The problem is you make much less energy than you would do if you were running it through the major process making oxygen. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that when you're deficient in thiamine, or when you have an oxygen deficit, you can't funnel the precursor down one route, so it has to go down a backup route, and the backup route makes lactic acid. The problem is you then have to recycle that lactic acid in the liver via something called the Cori cycle. And overall, that is actually going to deplete you of more energy because you end up using up more ATP to do that. And the problem with this is, this is a normal physiologic response to something like intense exercise. And it's actually a healthy response to intense exercise. The problem is that when this happens under normal conditions, under conditions when you're not in intense exercise or when you're not suffocating, then actually what it is representing is that your energy metabolism, your system is entirely dysfunctional. You can't utilize substrate to make energy in any kind of an efficient way. So you're running off of a backup route. And now this is clinically referred to as lactic acidosis. And funnily enough, this is actually one of the diagnostic criteria for cardiovascular beriberi and perhaps neurologic beriberi as well. And this is one of the key features that a doctor would test is your levels of blood lactate. Now, you can measure on an organic acids test. You can measure urinary lactate levels. You can measure urinary pyruvate levels. So these are things that I measure. They can give some insight. But essentially, when this happens, your body becomes overloaded with lactic acid. You develop some kind of a minor acidosis. This can kill someone if it is extensive enough, but if it's very minor, then in effect, what it does is it has a variety of effects on certain genes, on how we are transcribing genes, but also on how our cells are able to essentially signal for energy production and how we're able to do things. So this is particularly important for something like diabetes. If you look at the effects of lactic acid on the insulin receptor or on the factors which govern whether the insulin receptor is sensitive or not, you see that elevated lactic acid inside the cells can actually cause something like diabetes. It can cause something like insulin resistance. It can lead to a variety of metabolic adaptations, which can potentially facilitate something like cancer further on down the line. So there is what we call the Warburg effect, when cancer cells are essentially running off of this mechanism, this lactate recycling. It's glycolysis to lactate to back to glucose in the liver, back to glycolysis. And it's just this permanent cycle of an energy deficit, if that kind of makes any sense.
Yep. That reminds me also, we're talking about that an unnatural state of something turned on so long. It reminds me of years ago when I read this study about, they referred to it as marathon runners paradox, where a lot of them will end up getting diabetes. And they end up producing, there's a lot of intense running, which would raise up their cortisol and then which have a glucose effect, that there is chronic stress to the system that could be facilitating that response and churning through that. Plus, a lot of them end up carb loading as well the nights before and having huge amounts of carbohydrates and then doing hundreds of kilometers over the course of weeks. So there's a real impact, obviously, with thiamine in those stages. And a lot of those people, those marathon runners, things, they also have a higher predisposition to getting heart disease and heart attacks as well.
They do. It's actually very interesting. The diabetes link, there is a strong link between thiamine deficiency and diabetes. So this is really important for anyone who currently has diabetes, type 1 or type 2, or even insulin resistance. So in diabetes, we actually have a renal wasting of thiamine. So these people, I'm not sure of the mechanism. I don't know if anyone does know the mechanism or why it happens, but essentially diabetic kidneys waste thiamine. They excrete more. Secondly, actually how well we are able to utilize thiamine in diabetes is reduced. So if you look at the plasma levels of thiamine in a diabetic compared to a healthy cohort, then the diabetics have up to 75% less thiamine than the average healthy cohort. And this is type 1 and type 2. So there have been notable deficiencies identified in the clinical literature in diabetes of thiamine. And in fact, there are certain researchers who propose one of the mechanisms of diabetic neuropathy and diabetic vascular damage may actually be due to a long-term chronic thiamine deficiency, because in fact, if you use certain types of thiamine, they have been used in diabetics, particularly to measure endothelial dysfunction, so how well the vascular system is able to contract and dilate, how well the cells are able to uptake glucose, and how well the nerves are able to function. And so actually what they found is using something called benfotiamine, which is a lipid-soluble form of thiamine, or high-dose thiamine hydrochloride, can actually pretty much reverse the neuropathy in some cases. It can reduce the vascular damage of hyperglycemia, so high blood sugar. So it basically counteracts that effect. And they think it's one of the reasons is because diabetics are unable to effectively make as much glutathione. Whereas when you give thiamine, you are increasing glutathione synthesis potentially in people who are deficient. But then you also have this significant reduction in blood glucose and in HbA1c. So that's glycosylated hemoglobin, basically hemoglobin that's been glycated. What they're finding is actually you can increase glucose uptake by giving high doses of thiamine, which kind of really suggests that actually maybe many of the cases of diabetes, although there's the whole metabolic picture to take into consideration, it makes you think whether actually thiamine deficiency plays a significant role in that.
Yeah, I've been wondering the same thing, especially in a lot of people that I've seen in the community that go low carbohydrate diets, even the HbA1c, I got to say that
HbA1c.
Right. HbA1c. A lot of the times they would still present over 5 a lot of the time, even when they've been low carbohydrate for a very long time. Their blood glucose averages are a lot more higher compared to someone that isn't diabetic on a low carbohydrate diet, even though they're eating the same foods. So there seems to be a very different metabolism going on, whether or not they're still slightly stuck in that Cori cycle and they haven't been able to switch off. And like you were saying beforehand, it sounds like it's the body's preservation technique in order to make sure that you're functioning, you're still alive. But when you're in that state, the standard foods may not be able to shift you out of that cycle once you're in that particular stage of metabolic metabolism.
Yeah, that's honestly what seems to be the case, because I have a lot of people coming to me maybe on a carnivorous diet, like a mostly animal-based diet, mostly ketogenic or low-carb or paleo diets, which are renowned for that kind of lower carbohydrate intake, right? Some of them are 0 carbohydrates. But in fact, in many of these people, they've tried these diets for a long time and it doesn't resolve the problem. And it's only when you identify the nutrient deficits and actually work to resolve those, oftentimes not through food. I mean, you do it the best that you can through food, but actually really replenishing those with very high doses. As I said, sometimes 100, 500 times the recommended daily intake. It's only then that you actually find that these people manage to address their health condition. And I have seen some wonderful cases, some miracle cases, whereby people were not aware that they had thiamine problems, but actually present with such a wide array of clinical symptoms, because a thiamine deficiency can cause just a really set of weird symptoms, which could not really be diagnosed as any other condition. When you add in thiamine, things actually start to improve after a while, after what is called the paradoxical effect, whereby people generally tend to get a little bit worse before they do get better for some reason.
Yeah. So speaking about carnivore, 0 carb diets, etc., and people that you've seen, so as we discussed beforehand, certain substances like coffee, etc., and then certain people that do go to carnivore diet, say a lot of the times have pre-existing health issues and then try to get themselves working better. Have you seen instances where people may be suffering some certain thiamine issues after doing a carnivorous diet?
Right. So I have not seen anyone who, generally people come to me either before they go on a carnivore diet or when they have been on a carnivore diet for like 6 months and they haven't got better. Okay. Because they assume that they're going to get better on the carnivore diet. But then when it's been a certain amount of time, they come to me because they want to know why it's not working as it works with other people. Now, what I have found, I will be honest, thiamine is people generally watch my videos and then come to me thinking that they already have a thiamine issue. And a lot of the time, this, because they've looked at the symptoms, because they have the history and stuff, oftentimes they're right. Oftentimes they clearly do have an issue and then we address that. I haven't seen anyone who's gone onto carnivore and then developed a thiamine problem. But what I fixed and then it's not. Sorry, did you lose me?
Yeah, just for a second. So you said the problem is that they think it's fixed and it's not. I think that's what you're going to say.
Yeah, so they go onto the carnivore diet and they think it's going to be fixed, but then it's not. And that actually, it's almost like the carnivore diet isn't enough to address it. Now, I have had some very interesting cases. Usually with the carnivore approach, I find that folate is the problem. So some people just seem to find it very difficult to maintain blood folate levels on a carnivorous approach, even if you're having sufficient amounts of organ meats. So that is something, and I think that there is some kind of genetic component there. It could be, MTHFR, something like that, which is going to cause that in some people. And this is one of the reasons why I honestly don't think that carnivore's for everyone. I think some people it is, but I think that some people literally, for whatever reason, just cannot do it. So I'm not black and white about that. No. But with regard to producing a deficiency, I can't see that thiamine would do that. A carnivore diet would do that unless it was very high in fat and it was low in thiamine. So if someone was not having sufficient amounts of organ meats, or if they were overcooking their food, or if they were having mostly processed meats like salami and these kinds of things containing sulfites, and then very high fat, that could theoretically cause a thiamine issue. Also, I was going to say, and then wash it down with a liter or gallon of coffee a day as well. Exactly.
A lot of carnivores all still have coffee, and people fight about it online. But if you're predisposed to that and you're having all of that together, it could be a perfect storm for some people.
Indeed, yeah, it really could be. And the other thing to consider is that many people go through what is called an adaptation to carnivore, which is like a temporary phase of diarrhea. Well, some people find that that is temporary. Other people have that for months on end, and they continually wait for it to get better, and it doesn't get better. And they're told by people that, okay, stay on carnivore and your digestion will miraculously get better. And it doesn't, for some people at least. For some people it does, but for some it doesn't. And for those people having chronic diarrhea for more than a month, you are asking for a thiamine deficiency. You're literally going to cause it. You're going to cause a bunch of other B vitamin deficiencies as well, and likely some electrolyte deficiencies. So it's like there are lots of associated problems that need to be identified on an individual basis, kind of case-by-case basis. But yeah, generally what I can say is that I'm not convinced that a nutrient-dense diet is enough to address a chronic thiamine deficiency. There is one more thing that I do want to say, which is very interesting, is that what you find is that with very, very, very sensitive individuals, that they, for instance, cannot tolerate any liver. They can't tolerate eating liver because it can. I mean, I've got a couple of people who, when they have liver, it puts them in bed for 2 days, right? Or it gives them severe fatigue and brain fog and joint pain and all of this stuff. And I have no way to explain that. It's potentially, there's some people who said it might be the vitamin A toxicity or something like that. Could be the histamine, but oftentimes it doesn't fit that clinical picture.
It doesn't fit that either with vitamin A, does it? Because a lot of the studies done on high dosage, the only person that's ever There was a laboratory assistant that mega dosed on vitamin A. He just got vision problems and headaches, and then he resolved fine in 48 hours. So no one's really died from it. There was an Australian study that was written quite good called Vitamin A Toxicity Reconsidered, and it talked about the expedition where they ate polar bear liver, and one of the guys was vegetarian and they were forced to eat their dogs, etc., and it went through their whole history. But there was a lot of instances at play, and it didn't even seem to correlate with vitamin A being the issue at the time. And the myth is sort of perpetuated about the vitamin A levels of toxicity. But I have also, like you, have noticed some people consuming liver that they end up getting fatigue or makes them feel very sick. And I haven't worked out exactly what it is in it, but some people seem to be also very sensitive to B vitamins full stop that I've seen as well, where they get headaches and they avoid most B vitamins. But the question is, in those instances, are they in such a deficient state that it just completely disrupts their system, or there could be something else going on?
Well, this is the really interesting thing, because I had no idea what was causing it. Just kind of accepted it as one of those really crazy things until I had one client. One client came to me about maybe 2 months ago now, and she said she went through. She'd been using thiamine, allithiamine in particular, and she said that she could not tolerate liver in any capacity. She'd have a tiny little bit, it would give her a headache, and it would give her all these horrible symptoms. It was only when she started taking thiamine that she could start eating liver, and she had no problems after taking thiamine. And so her theory was, and I never really considered this, but it's a very interesting one, is her theory is if you look at the nutrient content of liver, it's got some thiamine in, it's got a kind of a broad spectrum B vitamins, but it's very, very high in certain ones. It's very high in B2, for instance. It's extraordinarily high in B2 if you compare it to the other ones. And so compared to the rest of the Bs, it's relatively low in thiamine in comparison to something like B2 or something. So what she suspects is because these nutrients work in conjunction with each other, and there's very kind of intricate reactions between how they're all working together, and no one really understands exactly how that is yet. We just know that there are some interactions there, some established, some not established. But what it seems like is, or what her theory was that when she was eating liver, because she had this chronic thiamine deficiency, that she would be eating liver and it would be providing her with a temporary dose of very high levels of certain vitamins, which made her feel good for 2 or 3 days. But then all of a sudden, what those vitamins would do, because they were upregulating certain enzymes and other processes, it was in some way depleting her thiamine, or the amount of thiamine was not enough to account for the rest of the Bs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It almost sounds exactly like what Derek Lonsdale was talking about. What you were saying was things get slightly worse before they get better. It's almost as if you have a completely different metabolic machine that hasn't been functioning very well for a long time, and you pour the nutrients in and it starts chugging away to turn on, but it sort of really clunks and puts stress on the system, and then it's trying to start, but it might not be able to plug up to full efficiency. It's almost rusty trying to get going again. That's
what it seems. And then she says that when she took the thiamine, that actually she could start processing it, and she can now eat liver. So I think that maybe sometimes when you have these strong sensitivities, it's probably because you're unable to process it because one of the other nutrients is not in place. I think it's probably a lot more common than we think.
Yep. Awesome. And then the last subject I really wanted to touch on, which you spoke to me before we started recording, was about the oxalate factor. A lot of people in the carnivore community are concerned about oxalates, etc. But I think there's more to the story than just oxalates that is in dietary food intakes that might have an impact on the whole system.
Yeah, so oxalates is a really fascinating topic. I mean, I've done a couple of interviews on that in the past. There's Sally Norton, who is like an expert in that. has some fantastic lectures and talks. She's written a very good paper on it, and she's done tons of interviews. I even interviewed her myself, and she's a wealth of knowledge on that. And then there's also Susan Owens, who runs a Facebook group called Trying Low Oxalate. Okay, and essentially, oxalate or oxalic acid is it's an organic acid, and it's like a mineral chelator, so it binds very tightly with certain minerals, and it's used by plants potentially as a toxin against herbivores, against being eaten by certain plant eaters, to essentially protect itself, right? But what it also might do is use this chelator, this oxalic acid, to help it to retain certain minerals like calcium, because it has a very strong affinity for that. Well, unfortunately, what happens is when we eat these plants, the highest plants, kind of notably, are almond, spinach, many of the low-carb veggies, actually, what you would find on a ketogenic diet. Almonds, spinach, dark chocolate, so cacao, green tea, any kind of tea, many of the greens, certain berries, blueberries, some blackberries, that kind of thing. Many of the low-carb veggies are actually extraordinarily high, or even sweet potato is really quite high in oxalate. And what can actually happen is that when we consume these foods, we absorb that oxalate, and we absorb the soluble forms, so whether it's potassium or sodium oxalate, and then also the free oxalic acid. And what happens is that is absorbed into the bloodstream. It can filter through the kidneys, and the primary, really the most well-known problem associated with oxalates is kidney stones. So 80% of all kidney stones are actually composed of calcium oxalate crystals, and this is oxalate essentially traveling through the blood and binding tightly with calcium to form calcium oxalate, which then can aggregate to form a crystal and actually clog up the kidneys. But what isn't acknowledged is that actually oxalate can also have is really implicated in many other different chronic health conditions. So the research is focused primarily on kidney stones, and the scientists will assume that the only problem that can be caused is kidney stone. But in fact, they found oxalate in various tissues, such as the vascular system, the nerves. So oxalate is like a shard of glass. It's a very spiky kind of crystal. It can be lodged in nerves. It can be lodged in the brain, in the thyroid gland, in the breast, in the testicles, in the liver, in the kidneys, in the gut. It can be, you can get it in practically every single tissue. It causes mechanical stress that way. It's very sharp, and it causes inflammation, but at the same time, it has a biochemical role. So it also depletes certain nutrients, such as B6, biotin potentially, and it can get into cells, and it can basically act as disrupting our cellular biochemistry. So essentially, there's primarily, you would be getting oxalate from the diet. Now, if someone was having say 150 milligram intake in a day, that's not necessarily going to be a problem. But if someone's got chronic gut issues, or if they've got gut dysbiosis or something, this can increase the absorption, can actually cause them to get oxalate crystals in their joints or something and cause a real problem. But actually, there is also something called endogenous oxalate synthesis, and this is involving something called the glyoxalate pathway in the liver. And essentially, when the liver is metabolizing certain precursors, oxalate precursors, such as glyoxalate, the amino acid glycine hydroxyproline, essentially what can happen is if there is any kind of defect in that pathway, then you can have the production of excess oxalate in the liver. And then that can contribute to diabetes. It can contribute to all of these different things. Keep it simple. There is some indication that a thiamine deficiency may potentially facilitate endogenous oxalate synthesis in the liver. And this is because there is some animal research showing that when you deplete animals of thiamine, that actually they start making a bunch of oxalate in the liver. And then by giving them thiamine, this actually reduces oxalate synthesis.
Makes sense. Just give me one tick. Just give me one tick. Someone's just asking for help. I think it's my daughter. Just give me one tick.
Okay.
Sorry about that. My wife had quite a bad blood nose.
Oh, that's okay. It's okay. Is she okay?
Yeah, just quite a lot. So I gave her a bunch of tissues.
Okay.
I'll finish up fairly soon. We're near the end anyway. So
yeah.
Do we finish the oxalate thing?
Let me just say one more comment on that. Essentially, it's the link is not guaranteed. Like it's still theoretical. There's not much research on it, but there is reason to believe that if someone is low in thiamine, they might be more predisposed towards oxalate issues or endogenous oxalate synthesis. Generally, the people who do have problems, like established problems with oxalate, because they've had green smoothies and all of this kind of stuff in the past, they know they've got oxalate problems, then generally they tend to respond very well to thiamine. Okay.
That's very interesting.
So there is some kind of a link there, but I don't know if anyone necessarily knows exactly what it is.
All right. So what's the last part? Oh, the last part, I guess, as we're up to is where can people find you or get help from you personally if they suspect they have some of these issues, or they may respond negatively to liver, for instance, and they're not getting much help on their carnivore diet from other people, or just other weird things that they think they might resonate with this?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So for information, what I like to do is I make videos on YouTube. So I've got a YouTube channel. It's quite small at the moment, but I'm trying to build it because it's a good way to get information out to people and educate others. I make videos specifically. I've got lots of interviews on there. I've got videos that I've done on oxalates, on other kind of nutrients, on detoxification. But I've got quite a few on thiamine. I'm currently in the process of doing more on that. It's kind of my pet topic at the moment. So that's where I talk about the biochemistry, and we look at the exact kind of symptoms that this might produce in someone with, neurological symptoms, what to look out for, cardiovascular symptoms, other kind of symptoms and risk factors, why someone might develop this and what to do about that. So my YouTube channel is, if I didn't say already, it's EO Nutrition. So that's EO Nutrition. Then I have a website. It's www.eonutrition.co.uk. I occasionally write the odd article on there, but I am writing less these days. I am based in the UK, so I'm based in the Midlands in Staffordshire. If people, I consult with some people in real life, but I'll be honest, the majority of my client base these days is international or is via virtual consultations, because simply because not everyone can travel, thousands of miles to come see me where I am at my office. And yeah, I do a lot of work with people who think that they have these kinds of issues and want to know how to address that. Some people like to do testing. What we often find is that if someone has a suspected thiamine issue, they usually have issues with other vitamins, which generally also need to be worked on at the same time as resupplying thiamine B1. So yeah, that's generally what I do. I also have a Facebook page, so that's EO Nutrition as well. So yeah, if you I occasionally post up some articles and stuff on there. If you want to keep up to date, that's a great way to check out what I'm doing.
No worries. I'll post up all three of those platforms up in the comments below for everyone to be able to have a look and follow you and see your great work. So thank you very much for joining me here today. I really appreciate your time and going through all these probably undiscussed topics and not very popular topics at the moment that I believe deserves quite a bit of attention about how many different end states that they affect probably in everyday life. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks, Simon.